It began in the dark, under the pressure of another massive Russian aerial assault. Air raid sirens echoed across Ukraine as cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and waves of Shahed drones moved toward cities, power systems, and civilian infrastructure. Moscow had made this pattern familiar: hit the grid, hit heating, hit morale, and force the state to spend its energy on survival instead of resistance. But this time, something had changed in the sky. What the Kremlin had spent months dismissing was now in the fight. Ukraine's F-16s had entered the war, and their presence was already beginning to alter the logic of Russia's air campaign. That matters because this is not just a story about a new fighter jet entering service. It is a story about how Ukraine has started to narrow one of its most dangerous vulnerabilities, how Russia's long-range strike model is becoming more expensive and less efficient, and how Western military integration is moving from political symbolism to battlefield consequence. The arrival of the F-16 does not mean Ukraine suddenly controls the skies. It does mean the air war is no longer unfolding on the same terms that defined the first 2 years of the invasion. To see why, it is necessary to go back to where Ukraine started. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, Ukraine's Air Force was operating from a position of deep structural weakness. Much of its tactical aviation was still based on aging Soviet-era platforms, above all the MiG-29. These aircraft were built for a very different kind of conflict, in a very different technological age. They could still be flown skillfully, they could still be dangerous in the hands of determined pilots, but they were not designed to survive in an air environment saturated by modern long-range missiles, integrated air defenses, electronic warfare pressure, and constant surveillance. In the opening phase of the war, Ukraine lost a significant number of aircraft. Exact numbers remain contested depending on the source, but the broader reality was unmistakable. Ukraine entered the war with a limited air fleet and spent the early months trying to keep that force alive under severe pressure. The mythology of heroic resistance in the sky helped public morale, but it did not change the military balance. Ukraine did not achieve air superiority. It did not even come close. It lost the ability to dominate its own airspace almost immediately and was forced into a defensive adaptation model. That adaptation was serious and in many ways impressive. Ukrainian ground-based air defense systems, reinforced over time by Western contributions such as Patriot and Hawk systems, turned large areas of the country into hazardous operating zones for Russian aircraft. Ukraine imposed meaningful attrition on Russian aviation and prevented Moscow from fully exploiting its numerical advantage. This was a major achievement. But ground-based air defense has limits, and Russia adapted as well. One of the most damaging Russian adaptations was the large-scale use of glide bombs. Russian aircraft could release guided munitions from standoff distances that often placed them outside the effective reach of Ukrainian defenses. That changed the dynamic at the front. Instead of needing to penetrate deep into defended airspace, Russian bombers could stay farther back and still deliver destructive strikes against fortifications, logistics hubs, and frontline positions. The result was brutal. These strikes helped support Russian grinding advances by destroying defensive infrastructure before infantry assaults moved in. The damage extended well beyond the battlefield. Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukraine's energy system became one of the central instruments of wartime coercion. The objective was not simply destruction for its own sake. It was to create cascading weakness, blackouts, heating failures, water disruptions, repair costs, public exhaustion, and long-term strain on the state's capacity to keep functioning under fire. Once again, Ukraine adapted, but adaptation without the right aircraft left it fighting a structurally unequal air war. That is why the pressure campaign for F-16s became so important. For months, Kyiv pushed Western governments to move beyond incremental support and approve fighter transfers. The argument from the Ukrainian side was straightforward. Without modern aviation, the country's defensive capacity would remain permanently constrained. Without better airborne interception and strike capability, Russian aircraft would continue exploiting gaps. And without aircraft built to integrate naturally with Western missiles, bombs, and maintenance systems, Ukraine would remain stuck in an awkward hybrid model, Soviet planes trying to fire Western weapons through improvised solutions. The reluctance from NATO states was also real. Fighter jets felt politically sensitive in a way that artillery, armored vehicles, and even advanced air defense systems did not. Every expansion of support had produced warnings from Moscow. Yet the pattern was already familiar. Russia threatened escalation, Western capitals hesitated, battlefield necessity grew, and eventually another threshold was crossed. Fighter aircraft followed that same path. When the first F-16s finally arrived in Ukraine in August 2024, The transfer was not just military. It was strategic and symbolic at the same time. It signaled that the West was no longer merely helping Ukraine survive under bombardment. It was beginning to help Ukraine reconfigure the structure of its armed forces around Western standards. That distinction is enormous. A donated tank is one thing. A transition toward a Western-built Air Force is another. The F-16 was not selected because it is the newest aircraft in the world or the most exotic. It matters because it is mature, widely used, deeply integrated into NATO logistics, and compatible with a huge ecosystem of weapons and support systems. In war, that matters more than glamour. Sustainment, interoperability, repairability, and ammunition access are what turn a platform from a headline into a strategic asset. Compared with the MiG-29, the shift is profound. The MiG can still fly and fight, but it was operating at a severe disadvantage in a battle space shaped by modern Russian systems. Its radar limitations, its weaker electronic warfare suite, and its reduced compatibility with Western munitions all narrowed Ukraine's options. Pilots often had to stay low, use terrain masking, and avoid the kinds of engagements that a better-equipped aircraft could contest more directly. Against Russian fighters armed with modern long-range missiles, the imbalance was severe. The F-16 changes that equation in several ways at once. First, it improves detection and engagement dynamics. Modernized F-16 variants offer radar and avionics capabilities that make them far more viable in contested environments than Ukraine's aging Soviet fleet. They do not erase Russian advantages overnight, but they reduce the one-sidedness of the air fight. That alone is strategically meaningful. Second, the aircraft brings a far stronger electronic warfare and survivability package. In modern air combat, raw speed and maneuverability are only part of the story. A pilot who can see earlier, jam better, coordinate faster, and fire more effectively is operating in a completely different tactical universe. This is where the F-16 has long been valued. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the jet plugs directly into NATO's munitions ecosystem. This point is easy to underestimate, but it may be the most consequential of all. Before Western fighters arrived, Ukraine often had to improvise compatibility for Western strike weapons on Soviet-era aircraft. Some integrations were cumbersome, others were limited, some were not practical at all. With the F-16, that friction drops dramatically. Ukraine gains access not just to a plane, but to an established architecture of missiles, bombs, parts, training systems, and industrial supply lines. That is the difference between receiving equipment and joining a system. And that system is already producing results. According to Ukrainian accounts and reporting cited throughout the source material, F-16 crews have intercepted large numbers of airborne threats since entering service, including cruise missiles and one-way attack drones. These are not symbolic patrols. These are combat missions with direct effects on civilian protection, infrastructure survivability, and the overall cost-benefit balance of Russia's strike campaign. The significance of those interceptions goes far beyond the individual numbers. Every cruise missile shot down is not just an avoided explosion. It is preserved electrical capacity, a functioning rail line, an intact transformer, a hospital that stays online, a repair crew that does not have to work through the night in freezing conditions. In strategic terms, missile interception is state preservation. Some individual episodes stand out even within that broader pattern. Ukrainian pilots have reportedly achieved unusually high kill counts in single sorties, including using onboard cannon fire to destroy incoming cruise missiles after expending missiles. That is an extraordinarily demanding task under real combat conditions. It requires precision, nerve, timing, and the ability to execute tactics that many pilots would know mostly from training environments rather than repeated wartime use. These kinds of engagements matter because they demonstrate not just platform capability, but pilot adaptation. Ukraine is not simply receiving Western hardware and employing it passively. Its pilots are learning, improvising, and turning combat necessity into doctrine in real time. The ground attack role matters just as much. The F-16 is not only helping defend Ukrainian skies, it is also being used to hit Russian military targets, including logistics nodes, command infrastructure, drone positions, and ammunition storage. This dual role is central to why the aircraft changes the war's rhythm. A jet that can intercept missiles one day and support strike operations the next does more than add tactical flexibility. It complicates Russian planning at multiple levels. Moscow now has to factor in a growing Ukrainian capacity to contest both the incoming strike and the rear area structure supporting it. This has direct implications for one of Russia's most important wartime methods, launching glide bombs from relatively safe distances. If Ukrainian aircraft can extend the threat envelope, suppress radar, and impose more risk on Russian aviation, then Russian bombers may have to operate farther back, alter routes, or accept higher exposure. Even small changes in launch geometry can reduce strike effectiveness. In attritional warfare, reduced effectiveness compounds over time. That is why the F-16's value is not measured only in aircraft versus aircraft combat. It lies equally in shaping the broader air environment. A platform that forces Russian pilots to think differently, reposition assets, change release behavior, and expend more effort for the same result is already generating strategic effect. The technical learning curve behind all this should not be underestimated. Ukraine did not inherit an F-16 culture. It had to build one while fighting a full-scale war. Pilots trained abroad, mechanics had to be retrained, command and control structures had to be adjusted. Maintenance rhythms, weapons loading practices, communications procedures, and dispersed basing concepts all had to be developed under pressure. This is not something a state accomplishes casually, and certainly not in peacetime comfort. It had to happen fast, while under missile attack, with limited margins for error. That matters because one of the most revealing parts of the F-16 story is not just combat success, but institutional adaptation. Ukrainian aviation personnel appear to have embraced a highly flexible operational model, frequently relocating aircraft, minimizing predictability, and using dispersed operations to reduce vulnerability. In Western terminology, this aligns with the concept of agile combat employment. In Ukrainian hands, it has become less a doctrine seminar and more a survival requirement. There have also been losses, and they are important to acknowledge because this is not a miracle narrative. Ukraine's F-16 effort has reportedly suffered aircraft and pilot losses since the platform entered service. These losses underline an obvious point that should not be lost amid celebration. The skies over Ukraine remain extremely dangerous. Russia still fields layered air defenses, advanced missiles, and a large aviation force. No one serious should pretend the F-16 has made Ukrainian air operations safe. It has made them more effective. That is a different claim, and it is the correct one. One early loss in particular exposed the complexity of integrating a foreign aircraft into the middle of an ongoing war. Operating a completely new platform in one of the most hostile air environments in the world creates risks that go beyond enemy fire. Friendly fire fears, coordination errors, and institutional inexperience all become more dangerous when the platform, procedures, and support architecture are still being absorbed. This is what makes the program's battlefield performance more notable, not less. The achievement is not that Ukraine faced no friction. It is that it managed to operationalize the aircraft despite enormous friction. In strategic terms, the longer-range significance may outweigh even the immediate combat record. Before Western fighters arrived, Ukraine's relationship to NATO-supplied air munitions was structurally inefficient. Soviet aircraft could not easily unlock the full benefits of Western military aid. Now that begins to change. An F-16 is not just a plane with weapons attached. It is a bridge into a wider Western arsenal and into the industrial logic that sustains long wars. And this war has become exactly that, a long war. Russia's wager has always depended on mass, endurance, and the belief that it can outlast Ukraine politically, economically, and militarily. From that perspective, the F-16 is dangerous to Moscow, not merely because it shoots things down, but because it helps tie Ukraine more tightly to the industrial depth of the alliance backing it. NATO countries have stockpiles, production chains, training pipelines, and decades of accumulated knowledge built around this aircraft and its weapons family. Once Ukraine enters that ecosystem, Russia is no longer just fighting a battered post-Soviet air force with foreign donations. It is confronting a force gradually being rebuilt on Western foundations. And the story may not end with the F-16. Discussion of additional Western aircraft for Ukraine, including Mirage 2000s and other possible future platforms, suggests that the long-term trajectory could be much bigger than one transfer program. What is emerging is not simply an ad hoc upgrade. It is the early architecture of a new Ukrainian Air Force, one aligned with Western standards, compatible with Western weapons, and supported by Western training and logistics. That is a strategic development Moscow cannot dismiss. Russian officials, of course, have tried. The Kremlin's public line has been familiar. Western-supplied fighters will be shot down. They will not change the course of the war, and they amount to escalation theater rather than real battlefield substance. This rhetoric fits a pattern. The same formula was used against HIMARS, Patriot systems, Western tanks, and other capabilities that later proved materially important. First came the threats, then came the dismissal. Then came battlefield adaptation by Ukraine and visible inconvenience for Russia. The F-16 is following that pattern. By late 2025 and into 2026, it had become clear that Ukrainian F-16s were flying regularly, intercepting airborne threats, and carrying out strike missions. At the same time, the ground war remained brutally difficult. Russian forces continued to apply pressure in key eastern sectors, and Ukraine's overall military situation remained serious. That dual reality matters. The F-16 has not solved every battlefield problem. It has changed the strategic balance within one important domain of the war. That is enough to matter enormously without needing to become mythologized into total victory. The attritional economics are especially important here. Large Russian missile and drone barrages are expensive. They are not free instruments of pressure. They consume production capacity, high-value components, and budgetary resources that Russia also needs for artillery, armored vehicle replacement, personnel support, and broader wartime sustainment. If Ukrainian air defenses, now reinforced by F-16 operations, make those barrages less effective, then Moscow is forced into a worse exchange ratio. It has to spend more to achieve less. That is one of the clearest signs that the game is changing. Wars of attrition are not won only by territory captured in a given month. They are also shaped by cost curves. How much does each side spend to produce a given effect? How sustainable is the effort? How much industrial depth sits behind each weapon system? How quickly can losses be replaced? The F-16 matters because it shifts some of those calculations in Ukraine's favor. The platform also intersects with Ukraine's broader strategy beyond purely defensive interception. If Ukraine can use Western aircraft to support operations that pressure Russian logistics, challenge bomber launch zones, and complicate the use of Russian territory as a sanctuary, then the war's geometry changes further. Russian planners prefer depth. They prefer rear areas that feel protected, launch zones that remain just outside effective retaliation, and a front line shaped by constant pressure from above. The more Ukraine can disrupt that model, the more Moscow loses the comfort of distance. This is particularly relevant in the context of cross-border operations and strikes linked to Russian infrastructure, command systems, and bomber support networks. Even without a dramatic air superiority campaign, the ability to impose selective pressure changes strategic behavior. It forces Russia to defend more points, spread more resources, and operate with less confidence. And confidence is a major part of this war. Putin's original assumptions in early 2022 were built on a rapid Ukrainian collapse, weak Western endurance, and the belief that Russia could impose its will before Ukraine fully reorganized. Those assumptions failed. 3 years later, Ukraine is still fighting, NATO cohesion remains intact, and Western military support has moved far beyond what Moscow expected at the beginning. The F-16 program is one of the clearest symbols of that evolution. It shows that Ukraine's military is not frozen in its 2022 condition. It is adapting under fire and becoming more deeply integrated with the alliance supporting it. There is another layer as well, and it reaches beyond Ukraine. Western powers are learning from this war in real time. The performance of aircraft, munitions, dispersed basing concepts, pilot adaptation, and contested airspace operations in Ukraine is being studied closely. In that sense, Ukraine is not only receiving aid, it is also becoming a battlefield laboratory for NATO-era air warfare under real conditions. That has implications for doctrine, procurement, and deterrence far beyond Eastern Europe. Russia is not just facing Ukrainian adaptation, it is facing the feedback loop of an alliance observing, adjusting, and refining itself through the conflict. That is bad news for the Kremlin in ways that go beyond immediate missile interceptions. It means the war is producing a stronger, more informed, and more integrated Western response than Moscow likely expected. It means Russian tactics trigger adaptation rather than paralysis. It means every new system introduced into Ukrainian service can generate not only combat effect, but institutional learning across the alliance. The longer this continues, the harder it becomes for Russia to rely on old assumptions. And that brings us back to the central point. Ukraine's F-16s are not winning the war on their own. They are doing something more realistic and, in some ways, more important. They are reducing the effectiveness of Russia's air assault model. They are helping defend infrastructure and civilian life. They are increasing the cost of Russian strike campaigns. They are integrating Ukraine more deeply into Western supply and weapons architecture. They are creating new risks for Russian bombers and support nodes. And they are signaling that Ukrainian military modernization under wartime conditions is not only possible, but already underway. That is why the phrase, "the game has changed," is not just thumbnail language in this case. It captures a real strategic shift. For the first 2 years of the war, Ukraine fought the air battle largely through ground defense, improvisation, and endurance. Now it is beginning to fight with a modern Western aircraft that reshapes both defense and offense. The skies are still contested. Russia is still dangerous. The front is still brutal. But the air war is no longer what it was before the F-16 arrived. And that is exactly why Moscow is paying such close attention.